Hello, YouTube world. Close the curtain. Hello again, Gordon Causey, as always, and as always, Candy the Wonder Pup. Three and a half years old. Not exactly a puppy. It's closer to 4 than 3. Anyway, gonna get her going. I gotta get Candy taken care of, though. Shake, lay down. Speak. Don't chuff. Speak. Yeah, close enough. And there's her treat. And as I always say, that buys me peace, although you'll probably hear her during the course of my video. She tends to ramble around and play with things, move things around. She's a border collie and needs to be engaged. Wanted to talk tonight. A bit of a rambling video. I'm going to talk about some things that are on my mind. The genesis for this was there's a singer by the name of Oliver. I forget his last name. Should have looked it up, but who cares? He's got this song, "The Rich North of Richmond." You may have heard it. That is apparently blown up. Very young guy. I think he's from Virginia in the United States. And the rich man north of Richmond, or the rich men north of Richmond, how they don't care about the working class and they don't think we know, but I know that you do. If you haven't heard the song, you guys got a good voice. The video is him just standing in a field somewhere, maybe with a backdrop of trees, playing on an acoustic guitar with a mic, a couple dogs at the side. But he's got a soulful voice, powerful, soulful, and he talks about working overtime hours for bullshit pay, and it's blown up. I often wonder the degree to which things blow up, how much of it is orchestrated and how much of it is genuine. I think we tend to be herded. I think things often go viral because they're made to go viral. I've talked about that in previous videos about how there are services you can employ. If I wanted my YouTube channel, this pathetic, miserable little channel, to all of a sudden have thousands of followers, that's easy enough to do, as I understand it. It's just a matter of paying some service companies, and they populate, they have bots subscribe, so that when someone comes across your channel, they say, oh my gosh, this guy has 8,700 followers. Oh, maybe this must be good. And likewise for hits. They can bombard your channel with hits so that people will say, oh my gosh, and everyone looks at this stuff. This video has been viewed 8 million times. It must be good. This herd mentality. And no one's immune to it. I think there are degrees, but I think we're all influenced by it to one degree or another. But anyway, getting back to Jordan Peterson, he did an interview with this singer. And it was a compelling interview, and I haven't even listened to the whole thing yet. It's damn near 2 hours long. I've listened to over an hour of it. And I enjoy Peterson's style. But who is he? I mean, everything in this world today is polarized. And lives are so busy. People want shortcuts. And I've talked about this before, how we're herded into our camps. And there are those like myself who enjoy listening to Jordan Peterson. Likewise, there are others who have been herded and told to disregard him and have portrayed him as something of an agent provocateur who is just out there to stir up the crowd and to gain, trying to gain followers, trying to gain engagement, because there is an element within the social media realm, a large element, that seeks to monetize their content. And so you need engagement, you need followers, and that brings in revenue. And that I don't know what degree, Jordan Peterson just if I think 10, 15 years ago, if you walked down a street in Canada, say in downtown Toronto, Yonge and Dundas Square, and you asked 100 people, do you know who Jordan Peterson is? I would guess you might have gotten one or two who would have been familiar with them. Former students, maybe, or anyone who's interested in Canadian psychologists, clinical psychologists. He was both he's a licensed clinical psychologist, at least I still think he is. I know they're trying to take his license away, or there's talk of that happening. And a professor, a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. And I'm guessing he came onto my radar probably sometime around the year 2015, 16, somewhere in and around that time frame. Because a video of him addressing what I believe is called a body called the Cambridge Union at Cambridge University in England. He was doing something of a symposium, if you will. He was up on stage with, I guess, a moderator of sorts, and a packed auditorium full of students who were asking this preeminent clinical psychologist and professor of psychology questions. And one young man, where this video centers on, one young man had obviously scripted out a question. I think I'm convinced that this was not just off the cuff. He had planned this, scripted it out. It seems like a very intelligent young man, very idealistic. And he wanted to put it to Jordan Peterson. He was obviously concerned about climate change. And he was asking Jordan Peterson whether the issue of climate change, which for him was an irrefutable fact that climate change is the result of human activity. For this young lad, that was gospel truth, that human beings are the cause, and that if we could galvanize public opinion around the world around this issue, because it's incontrovertible that this could be the unifying factor. And Peterson, I gather, had used a turn of phrase either in his lectures or his books about the need for, in particular, young people, but everyone, but in particular young people, to have a map of meaning, a personal map of meaning. And this was the climax of his question: could climate change help us develop a global map of meaning? And Peterson just very bluntly started out by going, no. And just kind of let it drop there. And the audience, the students attending, laughed. And then Peterson went into his explanation as to why he didn't think that climate change could be the issue that would unite right and left and all segments of society. And one of the reasons was because the science on it is so convoluted and inconclusive. He made note of the fact that the computer modeled simulations they use to project climate change, that because they're based on assumptions that they have to put error bars. So they'll say, well, this is what the temperature is going to do. And then they had error bars around, would have on either side of that line would be error bars. So the max and the minimum, and then their projection. So, but then as you move forward in time, those error bars grow wider and wider apart as you project out into time. And so that within 5 to 10 years, it's impossible to know whether the actions you took 5-10 years ago, whether they actually had any impact or not, because climate is such a dynamic system. There are so many variables involved. How do you choose which ones? How do you weight them? It's impossible. I've talked about that in my my videos, how, there's just too many factors. And the simple reality is that throughout the course of human history, climate has changed. Medieval warming period, a 450-year period where temperatures soared, and then a little ice age where they fell, and then starting somewhere around 1800, this current phase that we're in of global warming. Now, the contention by climate change, those who say human beings are causing climate changes, they say, well, look, the temperature's gone up during this industrialized period when we started burning things like coal, etc. But we had a warming period from 950 AD until 1400 without industrialization. So how can you determine cause and effect? Correlation does not prove causation. It's an old standard line from science. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one caused the other. As whale populations have decreased, the divorce rate in westernized developed countries has increased. So does that mean that killing whales causes people to get divorced, or that people getting divorced causes whales to get killed? I use that as a ridiculous example to illustrate the point. Just because two things correlate does not mean that one caused the other. Anyway, so that talk was Peterson. I fact checked him because he made a number of assertions. He talked about the fact that Germany had engaged in switching over from fossil fuels for electric generation, and they switched. They had a big program to switch to wind and solar, and all that ended up happening was that when the sun went down and the wind wasn't blowing, they had to restart the coal generating plants to keep electricity on the grid because demand doesn't go away, and that there was no utility, and that the only result was that energy costs skyrocketed. Zero utility, zero benefit. He said if we don't, the problem with wind and solar, and this takes a little bit of understanding about how the power grid actually works. And I don't understand it in depth, but I do understand it on a broad scale. And there's a certain amount of load. There's a certain amount of wattage that needs to be on the grid. So as power is taken off the grid, it's almost like accounting. As power is taken off the grid, there needs to be a corresponding injection of power onto the grid. And if your power being supplied to the grid is coming from wind and solar, well, at night and when the wind isn't blowing, that power has to come from somewhere. Otherwise, the power grid will shut down, and you'll have brownouts and eventually blackouts. And so there needs to be this constant load, and that's the high up. It's far more detailed and complicated than that in terms of the resistors, and we see the transformer stations, and all those are designed to ensure that the system doesn't take on too much power, that it's always at a certain level. It's like the alternator in your car, ensuring that as your vehicle draws power from the electrical system, that there's an equal amount or roughly equal amount of power going on to the system. And he made the point that if we start relying on so-called renewable energies like solar and wind, that to augment those, what are people supposed to do? Burn wood? Incidentally, I fact-checked what he had said, and I would invite you to do the same if you're curious. And that's exactly as it was reported. That is what happened. The Germans found out that wind and solar were not a viable solution, and they had to go back to natural gas and coal-generated coal stations, burning coal for power. Said, well, if coal is bad, what are people going to do? They're going to burn wood. Yeah, maybe coal's bad, but are you going to burn wood? And then he made another point that I fact checked, and that was that there are more trees in the northern hemisphere now than there was 100 years ago, because 100 more years ago, people were burning wood. And now with modern forestry management and the like, there are more trees in the northern hemisphere now. Let's say he said this back around 2000, I think it was around 2015. I'm within a couple years of the actual date of the video. And that, was more or less my introduction to Jordan Peterson. And if you stick to the mainstream media, if you stick to in Canada, it's Global, CTV, CBC, and if you stick to those outlets, unfortunately, what's happened nowadays is we're given one side of a narrative. We're given one point of view. Journalism, as it's supposed to be, is to present all sides and to leave it up to the consumer of the news to sift through and make their own determination as to what the truth is, but to give equal weighting. And a quality journalist will never betray what their own personal bias is, which they will have. We all have our biases. And just put the facts out. And when you're dealing with opinion, having one expert will have one opinion, one expert will have another opinion. When it comes to climate change, there are experts who believe that the degree to which human activity impacts climate, that it is negligible. Others, of course, who you see all the time, will say that climate change, that it's irrefutable that human activity is causing it. And they use the cause and effect rationale. We're seeing hurricanes, we're seeing tornadoes, we're seeing severe weather events. Hence, that proves that it's human activity, because this has happened with this industrialized age. I referenced yesterday, there was an article in Democracy Now! Or some publication I never heard of, but they were talking about the fact, I'll take it as fact, that Washington, D.C. had never before recorded a temperature above 100 degrees in the month of September until this year, 2023. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that, come on, we've been keeping records. Sometimes the records go back maybe to the 1880s. So we're talking about 100 to 150 years worth of data on a planet that is goodness knows how old, depending on who you want to listen to, but typically the mainstream will say billions of years old. So on a planet that's billions of years old, and we've been keeping records for, if you look at the post-big ice age, I think the last ice age is said to have global ice age. When North America was apparently covered in ice, that was apparently 10,000 years ago. So we got 150 years worth of data versus 10,000 years of climate history. And I find the word disingenuous to be a bit of a buzzword. I don't like overusing buzzwords, but I find it disingenuous. It's just, pushing. But I got to get back to Jordan Peterson. And so I later found out that he had become something of a lightning rod, where I think where a lot of his prominence came from, initially at least, was over the fact that the University of Toronto, based on legislation being put forth by the Ontario government, that they had mandated what Peterson referred to as compelled speech, that you are compelled in terms of the transgender debate going on, that you would have to use an individual's preferred pronouns, that it would be required of you. And that was his issue, as I understand it, was not necessarily, someone comes up to me and says, I want to be referred to, a guy says, I want to be referred to as she, or if they're, what are they calling it, gender fluid or non-binary or whatever. Then they may want Z or their as their pronouns. And that were I not to use those pronouns, that I could be found guilty. It could be, I could be dragged before, I think, the Ontario Human Rights Commission for offending this person. God forbid someone should be offended. I find today's world difficult to navigate when I'm 57 now, and gosh, I grew up with comedians on TV like Don Rickles, and that was his whole shtick, was offending everyone. Don Rickles himself was Jewish, and he would make Jewish jokes, Italian jokes, black jokes, Latino jokes. He would go after everyone, any port in a storm to get a laugh. And could it be offensive? I showed it. When I was working at a radar station and we were working the midnight shift, I'd sometimes at least once I threw up an old video of Don Rickles to say, "What do you guys think of this?" to the young guys I worked with, and they were, "Wow." And it's like, that was de rigueur. That was normal during my time. When I was their age, when I was the age they are, that was just normal. No one batted an eyelash. Were people offended? I'm sure some were, but suck it up, buttercup. I mean, Peterson made a great comment. He was being interviewed by the BBC. He'd written a book called 12 Rules for Life. I should underline something. I actually don't watch him that much. I tend to catch snippets of him. I don't read his articles. I haven't read his books. The guy's got enough money. He doesn't need me. But he was on the CBC News, and I guess it was part of his book promotion for the 12 Rules for Life. And the interviewer was taking him to task and saying, "Why should you have the right to offend people?" And he threw it back right at her. "Well, you're certainly willing to offend me in your pursuit of truth." And then he said, "And more power to you. If you want to have meaningful dialogue, if you want to discuss things that are important, you have to be willing to risk offending others and of being offended yourself, of having your sensibilities challenged." And this is why I find him such a compelling figure. But why is he blown up so much? And I think it's a function of our times. And I think this young kid with his song, "The Rich North of Richmond," and how that song has blown up, I think there's an undertow of complete dissatisfaction with the way the world is now. And part and parcel of that is people do still, to varying degrees, but I think people still do rely on the mainstream news, on the legacy media, and they go to those outlets, and people are waking up, I believe, to the idea that they are being programmed. They're not being informed. I've referenced it before, an old quote by Mark Twain, which Denzel Washington later borrowed when he was on the red carpet, I think at the Oscars. And he said, the quote is, if you don't pay attention to the news, then you're not informed. And if you do pay attention to the news, then you're misinformed. And I think a lot of people are opening their eyes to the fact that the media is no longer about information. The media is about programming, is about propaganda, is about pushing a narrative. I think the best example of that would be in recent times, go back to 2021 when the vaccines for COVID were first rolling out. The only thing that you would see in the mainstream legacy media with respect to the vaccines was that they were our ticket to the end of the pandemic, that they would provide long-lasting and sterilizing immunity to infection, and that there's a Rachel Maddow on CNBC, major mainstream outlet, and she gave a famous little video that went viral talking about how the virus stops with each vaccinated person. We now know, she said, that the vaccine that the virus stops with each vaccinated person, which means that it can't use you to go infect someone else. The vaccine stops the virus. And that was allowed to be said. She was allowed to say that, went far and wide. It could be on MSNBC, broadcast to millions of people, perfectly allowed. If anyone countered that, if anyone said, well, I don't think it'll work, and there were individuals saying that. I mentioned them in videos a long time ago, a while back, a year or more maybe. There's one, Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche, who has headed up programs for Gavi, Global Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunizations. Anyone in the pharmaceutical field knowing anything about vaccines knows about Gavi or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He worked for them as well in their vaccine programs. He worked for major pharmaceutical companies like Novartis and GSK in their in senior roles in their vaccine development programs. I think he headed up the vaccine development for GSK, GlaxoSmithKline. Guy was a sought after speaker in that field. One of the most highly qualified. Well, he famously came out March, April 2021 and said that what we will see, he said, by mass vaccinating billions of people worldwide, that it would put evolutionary pressure onto the virus because the virus is still circulating widely, and that it would put evolutionary pressure on the virus, and that we would see immune escape, that people would get sick with it regardless, and that it would lead to the emergence of a highly transmissible variant. And I read an article. I like to look at both sides. So I read an article McGill University put out separating science from fiction, something to that effect. And that they recognized that Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche was an eminently qualified individual, but they inferred that he was simply seeking notoriety by going counter narrative, and that there was nothing to substantiate his claims. But as we all know, because of Omicron, he proved out to be 100% right. He's a guy we should be listening to. He was not the only one. Dr. Luc Montagnier, a Nobel Prize winning virologist from France, was echoing the two of them. I don't know who said it first, and it doesn't matter to me. They were both basically saying the same thing, talking about things like this immune escape, talking about antibody AED, out of antibody something enhancement. And I don't have the requisite educational background to investigate this by myself, so I rely on those who do have the proper bona fides or bona fides, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And so I sought out the Geert Vanden Bossches, the Dr. Luc Montagnier's, found out what they were saying. And when I found out they were right, and others like Dr. Robert Malone, I said, well, am I going to continue listening to those who got everything completely wrong? And just because they got it wrong before doesn't mean they'll be wrong in the future. And just because Geert Vanden Bossche was right doesn't mean he'll be right about everything going forward. But it's an indication, and it also tells you the degree to which we're dealing with things that are unknown. Anyway, I'm going way off track. So Jordan Peterson was being promoted by many in the mainstream as something of an agent provocateur who, the same claims that they made about Geert Vanden Bossche about how, he's just going counter narrative to try and garner a following and make money. Jordan Peterson's doing the same thing. Gender is just a societal construct. And that is something that is presented as fact in the mainstream. And you have individuals like Jordan Peterson, who contended is not simply I don't think he discounts the existence of a condition referred to as gender dysphoria, where an individual believes they have a misassigned gender, that their inner being, if you will, is female, but their outer genitalia is male, and that you can be female in a male body or whatever, and that's presented as fact. Gender dysphoria, that was it's existed throughout all of human history. It's nothing new. There have always been men who have wanted to be women, and women have wanted to be men, and people who've thought, felt male one day and female the next. But do you treat that condition by affirming a person's feelings? I mean, I did a tongue-in-cheek video where I said I want to identify as 7 foot tall. Well, I'm going to ask everyone around me to hunker down so that I have the requisite height advantage over them, so that my height identity is confirmed. I mean, the world has gone crazy, and the thing is, when you turn to the mainstream media, you only hear the ideological narrative that's being pushed, and they only provide one side of the debate. And I think there's a lot of individuals who sit there and go, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. It doesn't sit right. I don't have a degree in clinical psychology or biology or any of the other requisite sciences that, allow me to speak to this intelligently, but there's just something at the core base of my being that says this is wrong. And then an individual like Jordan Peterson, who comes along, who has the requisite knowledge, experience, and educational background, and the ability to convey it in a compelling manner and to defend his point of view vigorously and incredibly effectively, he becomes something of a lightning rod. And people are like, I saw a comedian once, funny comedian, and he was saying to Jimmy Fallon, I think it's Tonight Show or whatever the show is called, but it's Jimmy Fallon. And he was saying to him that people don't know what they know. And he said, write down 100 things you know and write them out on a list. And then if you ask someone how they know those things, for 90% of the items on the list, people will say, well, some guy told me. Some guy told me. How do I know that gender is a societal construct? I read it somewhere. So it's true. Yeah, and this is the world we live in. And more people are divorcing themselves from that mindset of saying, well, if it's in the paper, it's got to be, if it's in the legacy media, it must be true. People are woken up, and to have a voice like Jordan Peterson's going against it and doing it in an articulate, forceful, and compelling fashion, this is the way the media should operate. Peterson blew up with his the initially taking University of Toronto to task and refusing to comply with their compelled speech rules. And then he wrote his book, 12 Rules for Life, and went on a speaking engagement and was on mainstream media broadcasts all over the world, in Australia, in England, in Canada, in the United States. Been on Bill Maher, Mr. Politically Incorrect, biggest Trump hater there is in the world, had Jordan Peterson on. And his fame grew. And then we had the COVID era, and he kind of went silent for a bit because, as I understand it, I think his wife was either incredibly ill or possibly even passed away. And he took was prescribed antidepressants and then became dependent upon them and wanted to get off them, and ended up going into Russia or something because he was having difficulty finding healthcare providers who would wean him off of these drugs, this medication. And then he slowly has been re-entering, and now he's partnered with Daily Wire, which is Ben Shapiro's outfit. And I just want to underline a couple things. Just some things he says that I disagree with, that I don't like. One in particular, a plus, what I guess they call a plus size model, was made the cover girl of the famous Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. So you had this rather large, I guess some might use the term voluptuous woman as the cover. And Peterson tweeted something to the effect of beautiful, not beautiful, or not pretty, or something to that effect. And it blew him up again for a bit. And that's one instance where I have to question to what degree he's being a provocateur. On the one hand, I think I understand why he would do something like that, and it's because of this pushing back against a prescribed narrative. Here's what's pretty, we're going to tell you. Here's what a man is, we're going to tell you. Here's what a woman is, we're going to tell you. We're going to frame your point of view. And he's pushing back against that. And so you tell me this is beautiful? No, it's not. And so I understand it from that perspective. But at the same time, I think he could have chosen his target better, because at the end of the day, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I saw the cover photo, and there's an old term from, I forget what term, 1600s, 1400s maybe. It was called Rubenesque. And a woman who was curvy and large was seen as, you watch the old masters, Raphael and Michelangelo and other great painters. Quite often the women were very large, and it was considered beautiful back then. So, the perceptions of beauty do change. And so, while I think I understand, I also think there's a tendency, Jordan Peterson, an individual such as himself, becomes something of an empire. During this interview he did with this singer, Anthony, whatever his name is, the rich north of Richmond, he was giving the young man advice, talking about what he's done in his own experience, having blown up, and how he has engaged in advisors, and how he's teamed with Daily Wire, and how he has something of a staff, if you will. And he becomes something of an industry, and that industry costs money. He's got people to employ, promotional costs. He's got a lot of, it's like the power grid. The money's as the money's draining out, money needs to be coming in. And so I think even for an individual such as himself, there's, whether it's conscious or unconscious, there's this need for engagement to keep the machinery working. I mean, that's, I would be, the chances of me ever having a live face-to-face or video conversation with Jordan Peterson are next to nil, but I have fun little conversations in my mind, and I imagine how I would engage, what our exchanges would be like. And that's one thing I might bring up with him. Another thing is, I love his biblical series. He takes the Bible and he dissects it, and he does it in a way that's not entirely religious. He does it from a he basically uses it in a lot of, he takes the metaphors and he expounds. Christians will refer to it sometimes as expository teaching, exposing layers that you don't necessarily see. And within the Christian community, there are certain Christians who ascribe to a strict literal interpretation of the Bible. Everything that's presented in the Bible is literal, historical, factual truth. And that's fair enough. There's value in that. There's value from knowing history. But I think people are robbing themselves if they look at it in that single layered fashion, because there's deeper meanings, far deeper meanings. The first one I probably came across was him talking about Cain and Abel, and I probably referenced this in a previous video, over how you have Cain and Abel, and Abel is a keeper of sheep, and Cain tills the ground, and the two of them bring their sacrifices to the Lord, and Abel's sacrifices find favor with the Lord, whereas Cain's sacrifices do not. So everything's working out super great for Abel, but not so good for Cain. And Cain then has the gall to go before the creator of all things and to say, I'm breaking my back here, and everyone loves Abel. What about me? And then Peterson infers that, well, maybe there's not enough blood in Cain's sacrifices. Again, Cain is a tiller of the field, so he's making grain offerings, perhaps, whereas Abel would be offering the firstlings of his flock with blood in them. Blood, sweat, tears, toil, sacrifice, and giving up. And he talks about this notion of the idea that so far back in ancient history, this notion that you could sacrifice, that you could give up for today to get for later. That's amazing, that so many thousands of years ago, goodness knows how many, because what is written in Genesis started out as an oral tradition. And tradition says that it was first written down by Moses thousands of years after. So these stories existed even before they were written down in an oral tradition. And so there are to quote Peterson from that little lecture he does on it, he talks about how the Bible, how stories like Cain and Abel, that you can't get to the bottom of them, that there's so much there, that there's so much depth of meaning that you can't ever get to the bottom of it. But anyway, I just wanted to ramble on a bit about Dr. Peterson, and I think he's someone worthwhile listening to. I still have my guard up somewhat, because things that go, we're all being herded in one direction or another, and I do my best to try and break out of my echo chamber. I still look at the mainstream legacy news daily, pretty much, and I'll read I don't have television, I don't have cable or satellite, so the idiot box is off. I engage with the legacy media in a digital fashion. I'll sometimes see their videos, I'll read the articles put out by, again, Canada, CBC, CTV Global. The United States, my preferences are ABC, CBS, NBC. I don't particularly care for CNN or Fox. I find them to be two sides of the same coin. And I find that the level of propaganda by each organization, one's going left, one's going right, but they're trying to push the news on you in the same fashion. When I look into a character like Donald Trump, did Trump do stupid things or say stupid things? Yes, of course he did. And when that would happen, CNN would loop it so that it was constantly coming up. And spinning things, and to make Trump look as bad as possible. But then likewise, Fox would take something good, positive. And one example I'll give is when the Trump administration, sorry, I had a moth. When the Trump administration had negotiated something of a rapprochement, an establishment of official relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And it was the Trump administration that negotiated that. For Fox News, they looped that and they made it seem like the greatest peace deal ever, of the last 50 years or whatever. Was it monumentally significant? No. So I think Fox was being disingenuous, but at the same time, the CNNs basically tried to paint it as being basically insignificant and meaningless. They went the other extreme, whereas the truth lies in the middle. The deal between the establishment of relations between Israel and the UAE is significant. To what degree, that's debatable, but to say it's hugely significant is wrong, and to say that it's barely worth noticing is also equally wrong. Truth lies somewhere in the middle. And so characters, one thing I would take, I'll end it off here. One thing, if I ever were to have this imaginary conversation, if it were ever to come to fruition, come to reality, one question I would ask Peterson is, I was incredibly surprised when he did an interview. He was on David Rubin's podcast. David Rubin is another interesting character. I don't see him as much, but he's seen as a right winger, which I find odd because he's a gay Jew. He's Jewish and he's gay, and people call him a Nazi. I find that mind-blowing. But regardless, David Rubin was interviewing Jordan Peterson. They were talking about the vaccines, and Peterson revealed that he had, in fact, gotten the COVID jabs. And I found that surprising for a man who seems to be able to discern so easily when there's an agenda, when there's propaganda. He seems to be very well able to discern when that's happening in so many other areas, and yet he failed to see it, and he got the jabs. Now he said in it, and pardon the swearing, I'm warning you now, an F-bomb is coming out, but I'm quoting Peterson. He said, yeah, I got the vaccine and I took a lot of grief for it, but I said, here's the deal. Okay, I'll get the vaccine, then you leave me the fuck alone. That was what Peterson said, or words very close to that. And then one thing I do appreciate, he then said, well, how did that work out? Stupid me. And that takes a degree of intelligence that I don't think most have, to admit when they've made a mistake. And maybe it's not intelligence, it's a level of self-awareness to recognize when you've been duped, when you've been fooled, when you've been taken advantage of. And I just would love to know how it was that he did not see through the propaganda machine when it came to that, whereas he's clearly able to see it on so many other fronts. And I know that he's a clinical psychologist, not a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are the ones who prescribe drugs. But is it the case where he just put blind faith in the medical profession and only listened to the predominating narrative and didn't bother to look beyond that which was being approved and authorized and allowed into the public discourse, and he didn't seek out alternative channels to get competing views? I'd love that, but as I say, it's probably a 1 in a million chance I'll ever have that conversation. But anyway, thanks for watching. I've gone on way too long, but I kind of enjoy doing it this way, just going off the top of my head, rambling on, as it were. Nothing scripted. I didn't even take down any notes. If you like my channel, if you like my videos, you know the drill. Like, share, subscribe, comment. I've said it often enough, but I want to repeat it. I mentioned already in this video how if I wanted my channel to go viral or whatever, it's easily enough done through the engagement of services, spend some money, but this channel is not monetized. I don't do it for that reason. I do want to inject my voice into the public discourse. I do think I have worthwhile things to say, but I'm not going to manipulate the system, work the system. I'm not going to pay the system to achieve that end. So if you like what I have to say, if you think there's some worthwhile content here, sorry for going on so long. I do know that shorter is better. But the likes, the subscriptions and such, they help because it's part of human nature. People see, oh, guy's got a few hundred subscribers. Maybe he's got something worthwhile to say. And maybe if that leads to 10 people looking, maybe a couple go, yeah, I agree. I do think he has something to say. And they subscribe, and things can snowball slowly. I'll recommend you listen to that song, The Rich North of Richmond, or something to that effect. I should have checked that guy's name before doing this, but whatever. Anyway, I've gone on for 51 minutes now. It's 11:23, and today is September 11th. I should have talked about that. I got enough views on that, but maybe I'll do that tomorrow or the next day. God bless. Check out Jordan Peterson if you haven't already. Let me know what you think. Comments are down below. We'll talk to you soon. Good night.